Welcome to Indie XP, which is part of the Unite Now series. The series is designed to support indie developers to level up their skills, business skills, and game ops skills. In this session, we're going to cover the broad topic of marketing. First, some intros. My name is Mark Robinson. I'm founder of Delta DNA. Delta DNA is an analytics platform that was acquired by Unity last year. So I'm an analytics guy at heart. And with me is Eric Zufert. Eric, would you like to give a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. My name is Eric Zufert. I'm an analyst slash consultant. Spent about 10 years in mobile. Started my career at Skype. Worked at a number of mobile gaming startups. Was the VP of user acquisition at Rovio, which is the company that makes Angry Birds. Then I founded my own company, which was a BI tool for mobile marketers. I sold that to a mobile gaming company based in San Francisco. And for about the last year, I've been just doing full-time kind of industry analysis and consulting. I maintain the trade blog mobiledevmemo.com and quantmar.com, which is a Stack Exchange-like Q&A site for marketers. And in 2014, I published the book Freemium Economics.
Great, thanks, Eric. Many of you guys will know Eric from games conferences when we were allowed out into the wild. Lots of great experience there for us to lean on as we talk about how to be successful in the marketing environment as part of your game development skill set. So one thing, Eric, just to frame the conversation, I wanted to ask to start us off, does marketing equal user acquisition, or is it broader than that for game developers?
Well, it's definitely a lot broader than that. I think, even within the kind of very sort of specific, kind of explicit function that user acquisition kind of exists as, marketing, or kind of the sort of traditional sense of product marketing, and, kind of user journey management, that has kind of become a much bigger kind of part of that scope. But I mean, if you would think about marketing and user acquisition, I tend to think of user acquisition as being not like a subset. I think a lot of people think about UA as being like UA and marketing as being kind of two concentric circles, where marketing is kind of the bigger one that encapsulates UA, and UA is kind of just a very specific function within marketing. I don't really think about it that way. I think about marketing as being kind of almost like a complementary, as being like functionally complementary to user acquisition, whereas user acquisition is very specific. It's kind of like a very well-defined kind of systematic process, and marketing, I think, is more of a sort of like conceptual, like applied kind of part of product design. So I don't see those. I don't see UA as being a subset of marketing. I see them being as being kind of two distinct things. But marketing is definitely broader. I think it just covers more ground. UA is very, very kind of well defined.
Yeah, so I guess what you're saying there, as regarding concept and design, one thing, and we're thinking specifically about the indie community. They're generally great developers, but they're sort of time sensitive for other sort of business topics a lot of the time. Thinking about your audience in the design phase is one of the things that will help on the road to success. The imagery and the cadence and the design of the game in terms of the audience that you're trying to appeal to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's for that reason, it's problematic to just conflate marketing with UA, right? Because I think a lot of times you talk to indies and you ask them like, what's your UA strategy? And they're like, well, I'm in India, I can't afford UA. And that's why you want to sort of segment the kind of UA activities away from marketing. I mean, you may be starting from just a complete cold start and have no money to do UA, but marketing starts way before, the game is done, right? I mean, marketing should be a big, the kind of game concepting phase is really like a marketing exercise, right? And I think a lot of indies don't do that. They have a cool game idea, a mechanic idea, and they just sort of, without putting too much thought into the kind of packaging, which is the aesthetic design, the tone, the look and feel, without putting too much thought into that. They start building something, and it turns into this like weird Frankenstein's monster of themes and tones and aesthetics, and then it just doesn't appeal to anybody. And so it's done, and they put it on the market, and even if they wanted to, they couldn't do any UA for it, and it just gets no sort of organic uptake either. That marketing exercise is really, really important, and that should actually be something that you put a lot of energy and time into, which is and you can do that for free. It's just a matter of like kind of surveying the market and seeing like, hey, what mechanics are best bundled with this kind of theme, and what theme is underserved, and when we kind of map this aesthetic to this kind of game mechanic, has that worked in the past? I wrote an article a couple years ago called I think it's called the Power Triad of mobile gaming design or something like that. Anyway, if you do a search on mobile dev memo for Triad, I think it'll come up. But the idea is that you've got kind of these three components to a game that relate to its distributability, right? You've got the mechanic, which is just the underlying the core game, basically. So examples of that would be like match 3 or 4x build and battle, endless runner, that kind of thing. So you got the core mechanic. You've got the theme, which is kind of the setting, right? So it's like pirates, or it's medieval, or it's space. It's the future or whatever. I don't know. It's underwater. And then you've got the tone, which is just sort of the aesthetic tone, which is like is it photorealistic? Is it cartoony? Is it dark? Is it upbeat? And all three of those things kind of have to be aligned in order for the game to kind of get traction, right? In order for it to be distributable just with paid marketing, or even for people to want to download it kind of apropos of nothing, just discovering it, right? You've got to have all three of those things align, and they've got to align for the best possible audience, right? Like and kind of the example I gave was like, if you think about Kim Kardashian, and I think this is the example in the article, so it's kind of outdated, but the Kim Kardashian game, I mean, it was like cartoony, and the setting was like Hollywood, right? And the mechanic was just almost kind of like city builder, friends, just sort of task completion. And like all three of those things are pretty well aligned with who do you think the audience for that game was. But if you had changed any one of those, right? If you change a setting, to space, like that wouldn't have worked. If it was Kim Kardashian, the Kim Kardashian in space doing all that stuff, I don't think that would have worked. And if you made the tone more photorealistic or dark, it just wouldn't have worked. Like all three of those things kind of fit together, in a way that kind of creates alignment and with the audience that they were trying to reach. And I think that's something that a lot of indies don't do. They don't kind of go through that exercise in the concepting phase of thinking about like, well, okay, what do we want to build first? And does anybody want what we want to build? And if not, maybe we have to dress it up a little differently than we would have, we would have liked. I remember I got into a kind of, I don't say an argument, but like at a company I worked at one time, and they were building, there's a team that wanted to build kind of like live kind of PvP, like synchronous PvP ship game. And they wanted all the main characters to be like kind of photorealistic-ish rats. And I was like, no one wants to, people don't like rats. No one likes rats. Like you can't use rats in the game. No one has like aspirations of being the best rat, or, killing other, being a rat that kills other rats. It can't be rats. Like make it something that's more accessible and people actually like.
Maybe squid would have been okay.
Anything is better than rats. I mean, there's a really funny, there's a funny scene in Mad Men when Conrad Hilton is trying to recruit Don Draper to work on the Hilton account. And he wants him to give like free advice. He wants him to give him like just his feedback on some campaign that they're running. And they have this little character in the advertisement, and it's a mouse. And Don Draper's like, well, no one wants to think about mice in a hotel room. And then Conrad Hilton just like rips it up. Like it's obvious, like that's just immediately kind of a no-go. And I think, it's just putting that amount of thought, like just almost like gut checking stuff, is part of the marketing process, that it just takes place before anything is even, any code is committed, right?
That's really interesting. So what exactly what you're saying is that it's not good enough to have a good idea or what you think is a good idea in isolation. You really need to do your due diligence and spend a bit of time, pause and do some research, and really convince yourself that the effort that you're going to start on is going to be worthwhile as much as you can, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the non-indie way of doing that is a marketability test, right? Which is coming up with a bunch of fake assets for a game and then running, putting marketing spend behind those and seeing which ones kind of resonate with the target audience. Now, you don't have to do that though. I mean, I think a lot of times actually that, and that process is valuable, but I've seen cases where people weren't really, they didn't have like a good command of the metrics. And so that actually created more confusion than it did answer questions. I've seen also like indies just have really, a lot of times like indies are really, really passionate gamers and they have good intuition about this stuff. Right. And I think just it's could be as simple as taking a day, getting together and just kind of taking a look through App Annie, looking at what are the top games, like where is this mechanic underserved? What is the market? Is there a demand for this kind of mechanic for the market that we're going after, the audience we're going after? Is it a big audience? Do they spend money? And just taking the time to do that and using that to help influence, the initial sort of design of the game could save you, a lot of headaches.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That sounds like really sound advice. In terms of thinking as you go through the sort of the development life cycle of the game, you're sort of you've passed that gate in terms of the due diligence. You're now convinced that the project is worthwhile. You're starting to write the code and build a game. What's marketing's contribution as you go through sort of pre-launch phases and getting closer to launch? What sort of things should indies think about in terms of setting up for success for it, from a marketing perspective?
Well, I think a big part of it is, marketing should really own the audience definition, right? They should own the kind of profile of the audience and they should know who the game is being built for. And so a lot of that, and again, I was talking about I don't think about marketing and user acquisition as two concentric circles. I really think about them as kind of like a Venn diagram, right? And that overlapping part is that kind of audience definition side and like the kind of ownership of the funnel metrics and like having an understanding of like, because there's a dynamic at play, you broaden targeting and a lot of times metrics deteriorate and like what's the sweet spot, like where are you making the most money and growing the game to the greatest degree. And I think that's where they overlap. And then obviously there's a lot of pieces of user acquisition that are not kind of part of like the kind of conceptual definition of what the product is and the messaging and the communications for that. But I think like just in terms of like an indie approaching marketing, I think it's really just kind of fundamentally important to understand are we reaching the right people? And if we are, right, are we optimizing the product for them, right? Because, again, you're going back to that dynamic, like you could be getting a ton of people into the app or into the game and churning them out, right? And the other side of that is you could be seeing amazing engagement and monetization metrics, but your audience is so small that it's not a viable business. There's a trade-off and there's a dynamic between those two things and finding the kind of optimal point across that dynamic is marketing's job. It's like, are we reaching the right, like, do we have the right game for the people that we're reaching, right? Or are we reaching the right people for this game, right? So it's, and then actually, usually it's some combination of changing both of those things. Like, okay, we're not targeting the right people. We're not bringing the right people in. And when I say targeting, I don't mean ad targeting. I could mean we're not using, like the tone and the appeal of our assets is not, it's not optimized, right? It's not ideal. And then, the game that we've built, is that the best game for the audience that we want to reach?
Because it's super iterative, right? I mean, you're trying to reveal and uncover information as you go along and refine, and maybe you adjust in terms of your approach. The audience finding the game finding the audience. That's that sort of style. I just wonder, as you're going through those cycles, what foundations do you need to put in place? And I'm thinking probably particularly of data and analytics here, so that you've got your kind of your finger on the pulse of how to make decisions around game design, audience, that sort of thing. This is my first love, obviously, and you've got a lot of expertise in data and analytics as well. What have you seen works well from putting those foundations in place?
Well, I think one mistake that a lot of people make, and indies, if you're scrimping on everything, it's just impossible to run a business. I mean, at some point you got to have tools that are fit for purpose. But with respect to analytics, I mean, one mistake that I see people make is they kind of take like a holistic view of the DAO, right? It's the Dow's up or Dow's down, or, whatever. We made more money today. ARPU was higher today. And, that's just not helpful, right? The way to approach that is, I think, first thing is to segment users by X number of dimensions. And the second thing is to cohort the Dow, right? Because what you're looking for really is like, is the game growing, right? Now you could have ARPU rising because you've got older cohorts that are spending more money, but the newer cohorts aren't spending any money, or there are no new cohorts. And if that's the case, your game's not really growing, right? It's just sort of like, it's kind of like in maybe it's in a good position while shrinking. And so, it's just having that cohorted sort of segmented view helps you understand, okay, where are we getting new users? Where are we getting the best new users? Which users are like the most sticky, and like, what's the composition of our DAU base in terms of age, right? And so a lot of times what you'll see, because as that changes, that's substantially going to change over time, right? If you think about a game that's a month old versus a game that's 2 years old, the age of the DAU base is going to be radically different, right? I mean, obviously, a game that's a month old, everyone's younger than a month, and they're new users, and sometimes new users are more excited, or they're spending more, and then, but also they're obviously a lot of that activity is a direct function of just either user acquisition or just some sort of inbound funnel. And you look at a game that's 2 years old, and there are actually proportionally very few new users, and most of the users are older, and so the game is accommodating two different audiences in those cases, right? And so as the game evolves and as the user base evolves, you have to sort of make accommodations for that. So you obviously can't do that unless you're cohorting users, and then obviously hopefully segmenting them based on acquisition source, and all these other sort of features that could give you some good insight into who they are and how they behave, and more importantly, how you get more of them.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think, as you iterate through different versions of the game, I mean, a lot of decisions at sort of medium-sized or enterprise-sized studios are based on LTV calculations, LTV predictions, that sort of thing. What is your advice to indies in that regard? Obviously, the whole profitability of the game is based on the LTV being bigger than the acquisition spend. So, is there a way that indies can get their head around lifetime value to make sound and sensible decisions on their acquisition strategies?
Yeah, I mean, I guess where I've seen people kind of trip over LTV stuff is, like, first of all, just overcomplicating it. Trying to build some like really complex model and using tools that aren't really necessary, like some sort of like neural network based LTV model that incorporates kind of like actually multiple models for different parts of the curve, like that. It's just unnecessary. Like, I've never seen a better approach than just curve fitting.
Yeah.
But the thing is, LTV is only really as good as the data, and the data needs to be segmented and cohorted, right, for recency. And there's going to be enough of it where you can, actually rely on whatever the prediction is, for the sort of whatever value that you're, whatever time-based value that you're looking at. I think a better approach than just trying to come up with an LTV, and I've written a lot about this. I think the most recent article I wrote about this was called, like, it's time to retire the LTV metric. And especially for indies, I don't think you should care so much about like an LTV. I think you should be optimizing for what's the kind of minimum recoup timeline that we can get away with while still scaling, while still growing the app, right? And then let's just sort of incrementally lengthen that timeline as we get more data and we get more sort of like robustness in the predictions, and there's less volatility. I wouldn't care about like a lifetime value. I mean, what difference does that make? There's no way you're going to be, especially most games coming out of soft launch can't robustly sort of in a way that kind of is like materially predictive. They can't come up with like a 1 year LTV. That you just can't. You just don't have enough data, and it's definitely not enough segmentable data, right? And so, what's the point? Like, what's the point of even doing that? Like, you're going to have this very unreliable metric with just a ton of error built into the prediction at, up to the year mark or whatever. I'd rather just focus on, okay, let's try to see if we can recoup our money in 1 month. And then as we've done that and we've seen these cohorts age, let's try to recoup our money in 2 months, and let's try to recoup our money in 3 months. I mean, especially if you're cash constrained, if you're not cash constrained, and I mean, a lot of companies, big companies, they'll be releasing like a match 3 title, right? And they've got 3 other match 3 titles in their portfolio, and they've got a lot of good data that they can use to sort of build the underlying model, and then just kind of seed that with the metrics from the new game. And they've got a lot of comparables that they can use. And so, and they're not cash constrained, so they can kind of be a little bit more risk tolerant. But if you're an indie, like, it's just not the way to go. I would just take that iterative sort of constantly sort of moving out the frontier of the recoup timeline. But I wouldn't try to even approach like an LTV calculation if I was an indie.
Yeah, makes sense. So another dilemma, I think, especially sort of in the early game life cycle, is getting enough volume to make sound decisions. You talked about, errors in the metrics, and there might be false premises if you're doing, even getting to some basic A/B testing. Before you want to part with your acquisition budget spend, what are the sort of the pro tips to get organic traffic through your game, so that at least you've got a base of players that you can start to make conjectures around?
Well, I mean, that unfortunately is very difficult.
Yeah.
I think it's like there is no kind of, if you build it, they will come mechanic in the app economy. It's a very competitive place. It's very busy. I think a lot of people, they get kind of some sense of false hope from like all these ASO agencies and the ASO content marketing that's out there. And I mean, ASO is just not going to, it's not going to work. It's not going to fix the cold start problem. You need some momentum somehow. And I think if you're taking a game development seriously as a business, right, even if you're just an indie, indie doesn't mean, you're not trying to build a viable company, right? Indie doesn't mean you're just wasting your time. Indie's not a hobby. I mean, if you're doing a hobby game, then whatever, then just release it, and you don't care if anybody plays it. But if you're an indie studio that actually is trying to build a business, then it's just user acquisition is a fundamental part of making that work. And it's just, that's just like a fact of life. And I mean, actually, I think most people are kind of fine with that. They're pretty zen with that now. I remember like a couple of years ago, you'd say that kind of thing, and people just get really almost like offended that they should have to do this kind of this work that they thought was kind of almost like obscene, or just overly commercializing their art. But the reality is, I mean, what are you going to do? This is like a very competitive marketplace. Like you're not gonna launch a shoe company and say we don't have a marketing budget, right? You're not gonna launch a car company and say we don't have a marketing budget. There are app developers that make billions of dollars a year. It's just that game mobile first game developers. So you can't compete with them. I mean, if you're trying to make a real business, you've got to have a marketing budget. So I mean, you got to have something, right? So I wouldn't kind of try to pin any hopes on just building an organic kind of baseline of traffic. I mean, it might happen, but it most likely won't. I don't think, at least not enough to build a sustainable like kind of business that you feel like is worth pursuing, and given the opportunity cost. So yeah, you have to have some level of marketing budget to kind of kickstart things.
Yeah. So the bad news is there isn't a tame community out there that the indie guys can reach into to sort of get their player testing done, which is a shame. Maybe that's a gap, because the games industry is super competitive, but it's also quite mutually supportive as well, especially around the indie landscape. Great insight. Okay, maybe last question. Is there anything else in terms of organic versus paid that you think is relevant to our audience today?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the kind of a critical kind of piece of insight that some people are like blind to is just the difference in profile of those types of users. And there's a difference in intent, and there's a difference in context to an organic and a paid user. And I think just being able to segment them, it helps so much with the kind of marketing measurement, but also the optimization of the game, right? So if I think about going back to that idea of like, let's say that you're a indie studio, you launch a game, and you're growing it just through kind of low scale paid acquisition, and that's 100% of the new users are paid, right? And you have a success, right? And it grows and grows and grows, and then 3 years later, you've got a game that actually 60% of the new users are organic, right? Well, you probably made a bunch of optimization changes, and I'm talking about in the game, not even the marketing, but just in the game early on, that you kind of take as, hey, I did this A/B test, and the variant A won, and that's sort of gospel now, that variant A is the best, and and that's at a point when all the users were paid, and now you've got a situation where most of the users are organic, and that variant A, right, is still in place. I mean, those kind of things have to be revisited, and it's not just a matter of like, well, we've got the average age of the DAU base has changed, but also the sort of source, of the DAU base has changed. And so like we've got most of our users came in organically, and they don't have any context, and they go into the Fatui and without any context. And you could be having a situation where like you're assuming too much about what they know about the game, having seen an ad, right? Whereas most of the users now have not seen ads, they just found it or they heard about it, or maybe they're more familiar for that reason. Their friend plays it and they know a lot about it, and you don't need to instruct them as much. Anyway, my point is like, you can't make those kind of assumptions. Those assumptions don't hold. Those assumptions aren't like permanent fixtures. Those assumptions need to be retested all the time. Which is not to say that, you need to be running the same A/B test over and over and over again. But I think as you see, first of all, A/B tests should always be driven by hypotheses. I think that's one thing that people don't take seriously. It's like doing this kind of experimentation, there's a reason, there's a reason that you go into an experiment, when you're using like the scientific method with a hypothesis, because you're testing the hypothesis. Is the whole point, right? And so if the hypothesis can reasonably change, and that the whole idea of that is that, there is some intuition that goes into it, right? And you're testing that intuition, right? And so, a lot of people don't have that kind of hypothesis testing mentality. There's like, let's say we test everything. Which is just dumb. It's a waste of time. And a lot of times it confounds decisions. But I mean, if that hypothesis meaningfully changes because, hey, the game's 3 years old and most of the people coming in now are organic versus paid, then yeah, you should retest it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really nice point, because A/B testing is it's an interesting topic. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot over the years at Delta DNA is it's interesting to get to test false premises. What could actually be a false move compared to what could be a positive move. It's equally valid learning where to avoid mistakes as well as to polish the game up. I think that's an important aspect of A/B testing as well. It's sometimes underused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
Okay, let's wrap it up there. Listen, that's been super insightful, Eric. Really, thanks a lot. I think we've covered in about 25 minutes about maybe a good chunk of years of experience in terms of marketing in the games industry. So incredibly grateful to you for your time. And thank you everybody else for listening. We'll see you on the
cheers. Thanks for having me.
one.